Good morning again, everyone. We will get started for today. Thank you so much for staying on for day 3 of the conference. So today is going to be a half-day event. As you see, we'll continue to have some very rich case discussions. We will look into, for instance, issues of design, whether we can build in into the design itself a certain value basis. So we will be hearing from Michelle shortly. And then we have got some case studies looking specifically, for example, at Vietnam and some of the other jurisdictions being looked into, and to see how certain forms of social listening has been helpful in addressing the challenge of COVID-19. We will be hearing from Dipshika subsequently after the intermission. I think on a very important issue that's linked to the very first presentation. Of course, that's to consider how gender could affect or impact on the justness or the fairness of particular responses or arrangements. And then, of course, finally, we will look at the social listening mechanisms that have been put in place in Indonesia in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So that would be the last presentation of the session. Following this, we will have a more general roundtable discussion. So I have to apologize to our participants on Zoom that this roundtable discussion is only available to in-person attendees for this conference. So which means that if you are joining us via Zoom, essentially the conference itself will end at around 12:15. So I do hope that that's all right. Of course, if you should have any comments whatsoever concerning any of these presentations or the conference in general, please do feel free to get in touch with us. We are always reachable by email. That's available on our website. And of course, I think it bears repetition that all the presentations in this conference will be available on our website, of course, subject to the presenters' agreement. So with this, I'm going to start off with a presentation by Karel and myself. So I'll do the presentation with Karel. Has been actively assisting us with social media. So if you're interested to follow developments on social media, you're very welcome to do so. I think because of the immense activities that we've had on Twitter or X, for example, there has been a restriction imposed on us, so we're not able to respond for a couple of days. But Karel, did you want to speak to that?
So first of all, Twitter thinks I'm a troll farm. Sorry, I mean, it's not the first time. They systematically block people for like 3 days that you can't like retweet, follow, or like. Because they claim that you broke their policies where they leave the real troll farms alone. It's a real problem. Another thing, I've also been posting on LinkedIn. A lot of people still think LinkedIn is, that place where you put your CV when you're looking for a job, but it's actually also a social media platform. Do have a look if you're not used to go there. So yes, please, people, like, retweet, and comment our posts. Okay.
Okay, so thanks so much. So there you have it. We are ourselves contributing to social listening, I suppose, depending on how you define this. So I thought in this presentation, I want to present in particular on the value of justice and how, particularly in thinking about the ethics guidance document that's being developed, right? We might want to give it greater prominence, or that's what we'd like to argue. So the argument itself is quite straightforward. I'm going to be quite quick about this. As far as epistemic justice is concerned, I think that we do have certain safeguards in place, so we can address some of the epistemic injustices that may affect us, particularly during an outbreak. But looking at recent experiences with COVID-19 responses in Hong Kong, especially during the 5th wave, I think that we can do better. So as you'd see here, we do have in Hong Kong a robust legal infrastructure that is essentially protective in nature. So, for example, there would be the basic law in place that would protect certain fundamental liberties. You see that the Siracusa principles do have legal force in Hong Kong. An illustrative case would be the Law Mei and Chief Executive of Hong Kong SAR decision of the Hong Kong Court of First Instance. There are, of course, important legislations in place that enables the government to respond to an outbreak. Of course, what has been very important during the COVID-19 outbreak, right, would be these three legislation. Of course, the Prevention and Control of Disease Ordinance, the Emergency Regulations Ordinance, as well as far as the Contact Tracing or Proximity Tracking Act is concerned, the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance. So we do have these basic regulatory and legal frameworks in place that would safeguard certain fundamental liberties. But it's less clear whether we have got any legal mechanisms in place that are capacitating. So I will elaborate a bit more on what I mean by this in the course of this presentation. I think that this particular approach is important to enable an ethics of care. So an ethics of care, if you're interested to find out what that is, right, just again referring back to Terry's presentation on day one, in the Association of Internet Researchers Ethics Guidelines, there's a whole document on ethics of care and addressing the situatedness of knowledge. So I'd like to go back to that and say that ultimately we need, if we're thinking of data collection and data application, we need to think hard about ultimately how we could bring back in the relationality, which, of course, in terms of the surveillance activity that tends to be done, it's the sort of abstraction that renders the individual and individual concerns as well as values invisible. So I think this is something that we need to bring in. So when we think about data, particularly from the standpoint of epistemic justice or avoiding epistemic injustice, we do need to question or better understand the why behind certain misinformation, disinformation, or otherwise malinformation. I think it's also an opportunity to draw in virtual ethics that speaks to trust and trustworthiness. Again, this is a point that I will get into in the course of my presentation. I do think that if we were to give greater prominence to epistemic justice, it is consistent with progressive realization in human rights discourse. At the same time, it also helps us develop equity promoting moral institutions. Of course, this is one of the central concerns in epistemic justice. And finally, we will set out some of the implications on governance. And you see that it's quite consistent with what some of our colleagues have mentioned, or at least so I would think. Again, we welcome your thoughts. So let's just set the context first. I think for those who are from Hong Kong, you'd be very familiar with this. As you know, the critical part of the pandemic where we in Hong Kong have been most affected, right, would be from 31st December 2021 to March last year. So that would have been the fifth wave of the COVID-19 outbreak in Hong Kong. And as you see here, right, it has during that period claimed the largest number of lives. And as you see, the mortality rate has been astonishing, much higher than what you see in the US and also comparatively in Singapore, because the size of the population is quite similar. So, so there are many reasons for this. Of course, the fifth wave basically caught a large segment of the population and certain policymakers off guard because we're talking about the Delta variant, which is a lot more infectious. And here I refer to some of the data that my colleagues from the medical school have presented. So if you look at the figures, you'd see from here, right, that ultimately at that critical period, the vaccination rate of, especially if you look at the chart, right, those who have been unvaccinated, the blue segment, those aged 70 and above, was extremely high. If you see the blue portion, right? So, so that's one of the key challenges that we had, because for Hong Kong we had hardly any cases, right, until the fifth wave. So, and then there was an immense spike, and mainly because it was during that critical period, we did not sufficiently prepare the population for what would be to come. And I think this would be a good opportunity to reflect on how we could do better for the next outbreak. And this is a problem that could have been avoided if we had better prepared the elderly to get vaccinated. And there are, of course, a few reasons for this, and the reasons are still being evaluated moving forward. So if you consider the mortality rate, ultimately, it's quite consistent with findings from other parts of the world. If you are older, for example, and particularly for those 70 years of age and above, right, those who have received at least one vaccination would have had increased chances of survival. And of course, you'd see that those who are younger and those who have been vaccinated, of course, were not as affected. So, so in thinking about how we could respond better, I thought it's a good opportunity. Oh, sorry, I do have one more slide on the overall mortality rate. So if you look at this, right, it does again point to something that is consistent with findings around the world. So if you're vaccinated, you're better protected, particularly if you are an older person or otherwise with an underlying health condition. So, so if we look at what the causes are, of course, one of the key challenges would have been communication. Hong Kong, as far as we know, and I stand to be corrected, we're not short on data. So in terms of surveillance data, we have lots of that. But what we make of the data and what actually goes back to the community is that huge question, right? So, so this, of course, following the fifth wave, has become a huge political issue, and again, I think it's a good time to look back and to think about how we could do better, particularly in terms of mechanisms that we can put forward. And here, because the challenge is not so much in the social listening as far as data collection is concerned, it's the challenge is not so much fair. So as I've mentioned, it's really the other way. What actually goes back? Do we understand enough why some of these, especially the older individuals, these communities, were resistant to vaccination? Perhaps they felt that there wasn't a particular need, there might be a particular risk perception of getting vaccination. So lots of very different reasons. And then there were also institutional and perhaps some of the more structural kind of obstacles to getting vaccinated. So a lot of these reasons are being unpacked, and well, I haven't got the time to delve into some of these reasons, but I want to focus in particular on the communicative aspect, which has been highlighted in one of the news articles in the South China Morning Post. So going back to social listening, I think this definition we're now all very familiar with, so I don't need to delve on this. But I want to introduce epistemic injustice or epistemic justice. So for those who are familiar with this concept, right, there are two forms of epistemic justice or injustice. So there will be the testimonial aspect, and then there would be the hermeneutic aspect. So testimonial would be when the credibility or the reliability of a particular individual's account is discounted by virtue of her or his social standing or social status. This could be linked to gender, which we'll hear more about. This could be linked to age. So, and I think this particular element is especially relevant if we think about social listening at the point of data collection. So when collecting data, if we think about the public health worker, they may be well-meaning, but are they sufficiently critically aware of deeply entrenched biases? As any other social agent operating within society, no one, whether public health workers or healthcare providers for that matter, would be immune from this kind of discussion. So in the bioethics literature, some of our colleagues are now looking into ways of linking epistemic injustice to the principle of non-maleficence. So we've heard from Marsha yesterday, of course, the bioethical principles. Within a healthcare context, within a clinical care context, of course, principle of non-maleficence is, or do no harm generally, is one of the key principles that are to be observed by healthcare providers. And arguably, if we draw on the principle of epistemic justice, a similar ethical obligation could be considered within a broader public health kind of context. I'm not saying that public health workers are ill intent. I think they're generally well-meaning individuals. They want to do good, but we do have to think about these biases that could be deep-seated and how we could address them. So that's the more testimonial aspect. So within a judicial context, right, the sort of work that's gone into this space would be to think about the testimony of a witness or some other expert, right, being reduced or discounted by virtue of her or his race or gender. So, for example, an individual of color as a witness may have his or her testimony discounted because of race, for instance. So that's an illustration of testimonial epistemic injustice. But more importantly, I want to focus on hermeneutic epistemic injustice, because when we talk about hermeneutic epistemic injustice, this particular injustice is always structural. So whereas testimonial tends to be individual at the individual level, of course, it could become structural if repeated over time. But if we think about some of the structural features, right, then it speaks to the sort of interpretive resources that a society lacks in order to make sense of important aspects of a speaker's experience, because she belongs to a social group that has been unfairly marginalized, she is in the speaker, in meaning-making activities. Which means that if, for example, and there's been quite a lot of work done in the context of healthcare provision, if as a healthcare provider, I am from a privileged background, then it will be very difficult for this individual, without working harder, right, to fully understand some of the experiences and challenges and the values of the individual being cared for. And more broadly, of course, going back to what Larry has mentioned earlier, right, in his session and also comments, if we think about, for example, sexual harassment, so that might have been acceptable, say 20 years ago, workplace sexual harassment. But one could argue that it's not because there's been a major change of ethical value that's attached to it, but rather that within society, there just wasn't the interpretive resource for individuals outside to recognize that it is ethically unacceptable, and of course now also legally questionable, for women to be sexually harassed within a workplace, for example. So this is illustrative of the sort of interpretive resource. So I highlight this because I think, as far as this ethical guidance document is concerned, it's an opportunity to make these resources available, first of all, to healthcare providers and to general members of the public, to be able to understand what are some of the critical concerns that could arise. So I wanted to elaborate when we think about structural epistemic injustice, this shared reality bias. So it just goes to emphasizing that if you have a group of people essentially just being connected with each other, but they themselves would react or would reflect structural inequality within a society, then the challenge of shared reality bias is a very real one. So in fact, it links up again to what Marsha has mentioned in the presentation yesterday. If we think about the public health worker as the recipient of the information, or policymaker for that matter, then ultimately the question is, do we have mechanisms to help these individuals review what they have what they have interpreted, how they have made sense of that particular data, and is this sense making consistent ultimately with individuals and communities ultimately affected, or is it essentially just an abstraction and a projection of what a privileged group might understand of another community or group that's disadvantaged? So I think that's something that we do need to think about. It's worth highlighting the final point on the slide here, that public health workers, again to emphasize, not well-meaning, but they are, sorry for the grammatical error, they are not immune to prejudicial forms of reasoning, since they are social agents like everybody else. whose beliefs and worldviews are embedded in a wider social and experiential context. And we do need to make this explicit. And so I wanted to very quickly go into the Infodemic Insight Report. So in a sense, if we are to complement some of the work that has already been done here, right, then there are some very critical things that we need to start to engage with. So if we look at some of these steps, right, so firstly, there's an explanation, of course, of what social listening is intended to do. As you see here, the second bullet point here, Infodemic Insight aim to inform an emergency response or response of a health program. And it's a process in the next bullet point. The process, of course, can be adapted depending on the phase of the output and available resourcing. There are some points that we might want to take note of. I agree, and that's a point that I will repeat later at the end, right? When we think about governance, I agree with what Sistine has mentioned in that in the presentation, social listening should be continuous. I think it's going to be very difficult. Of course, it may not be practicable in every health system, but I tend to think it's very difficult to suddenly start up something and then be aware of who are the least advantaged within society and try to understand their worldview. So there must be some basis in working this up. And I don't think that it's one of the, what Marcelo mentioned in terms of Bruno Latour, who's not here, but what Bruno Latour would call the immutable mobile, something that can be just transplanted within a particular context, whether it's from global health or other contexts, into a system, parachuted into a system and implemented suddenly, scaled up suddenly, or abruptly. So I think that, again, if we were to do that, my own sense is that the risk of shared reality bias is going to be very real. And ultimately, it will not advance the equitable objective or the justice or the justness objective that we want to that we should be directed at. So if we look at some of the, so this is going back to the insights report. So if we look at the starter questions, right, there are some questions that point to these concerns, but they don't go far enough. So it's still very much looking at data from a very general level of abstraction. And these kind of data don't speak to values, and they don't make clear why exactly individuals would hold particular points of views and what ultimately they care about or are concerned about. So if you look at that, because some of the others are quite essentially technical. So if you look at the first arrow, right, what questions or concerns do populations have about disease, infection, and prevention measures? So I'm going to flip back up, right? If you look at that, this would be step one. Because ultimately, if you look at step one of that, the diagram, right, it says choose the questions that infodemic management insights could help to answer. And then, of course, you go move forward in terms of developing an insight report. So these are the sort of questions being set up. And then the next arrow here, you see what are the values or reasons that people in community are raising in their discussion or health topic. Now that's quite interesting, but then it's going to be very difficult to my mind at least, for a public health worker without any exposure to ethics to draw in the values. So it's going to be, again, very technical in approach, but ultimately, how do you get to expressing the sort of values or reasons that affect people within community? Of course, those who are trained in social sciences will know that this will require quite a bit of experience in writing up a narrative in accurately and robustly representing the concerns and the values of any particular community. And of course, there would be issues of robustness and reliability. And finally, if you look at the final arrow here, right, how is narrative, memes, piece of misinformation changing or evolving over time? And how is it appearing in different communities, and what responses does it generate? Again, here, it seems to go back to having that sort of continuous social listening being done. But then, again, I think it's helpful to be reminded that although the scheme itself, the graphical scheme that we're seeing, seem to be a one-way traffic, right? It really should be a two-way thing. But how it is to be two ways is not exactly very clear. If we were to look further, of course, then there's again a further helpful illustration, and there are a number of these questions. So some of these questions would link to the kind of structural safeguards that are already in place. But of course, my argument, as I've stated from the start, is that we need to go further. So if you look at, I've just taken out what I think would be the more value-laden kind of question. But again, having worked with students in public health, students in medical school, it's very difficult for them to know what to do with these questions unless they've been properly equipped to think in a value-based way, so an ethically informed way. So otherwise, it's going to be essentially very formulaic in response without the sort of critical reflection and thinking and teasing out of ultimately the concerns of individuals and communities. So I thought that for the ethics guidance document, one possible approach may be to put forward something like the Johnson's four-box ethical model. So this would be very applied. Of course, this is within a therapeutic or healthcare context, but we may want to consider something like this, if practicable, to guide healthcare workers in thinking through the issues. And I think if we were to invest in explicating what epistemic justice means or avoiding epistemic injustice, it could speak to how we ought to understand trust and trustworthiness. So that's going into the work of Baroness Honora O'Neill. Some of you may know of her work. So, but what's interesting is that like Miranda's work on epistemic justice, Honora O'Neill is essentially focused in her work on individual healthcare providers. So this is at the provider level and individual essentially in nature. So it doesn't, or their approach don't quite go into addressing structural concerns. But ultimately, if we have structural deep-seated biases, for example, that were discussed at the start, right, these will require other forms of responses beyond the individual. So saying that while we do recognize the need for some basis in virtue ethics to address some of these issues, we do need to think hard about some of the structural changes that must follow, for example, through legislative means. So final slide now. So in terms of thinking about implications for governance, if we are to draw on epistemic justice or notions of epistemic injustice, as I've mentioned, and again, I do agree with what Sistine has mentioned, that social listening should be continuous and should be focused on capacitating the least advantaged in society. So in a sense, while there are legal safeguards in place, we need to do more. So these could be in the form of legislation, or otherwise it could be in through the introduction of other kinds of mechanisms, such as ethical mechanisms. So in Hong Kong, for example, I think we can say that what would be helpful from a legal standpoint, like to look at our mental capacity regime, so that there isn't anything equivalent to the Mental Capacity Act in the UK. So the Mental Health Ordinance is really quite an old legislation. So while certain reviews are in place, that's something that could be looked into. So these developments would be illustrative of capacitating mechanisms that could be put in place. So that's one avenue to consider. But then there are also other avenues that we could consider in supporting more two-way communication. So as I've mentioned, in Hong Kong, we're not short on data. We've got lots of data. But ultimately, what do we do with the data, and how much of it actually gets back to communities in terms of richer forms of engagement? So that's something that we do need to think quite hard about. And also when we think about the data itself, right, do they, as I've mentioned, do they speak to values? Do they tell us ultimately about what sort of concerns these individuals have or communities have? So for example, if we go back to during the fifth wave of the pandemic, why do elderly people feel they do not need to get vaccinated? Is it because they feel that the pandemic is coming to an end, because Hong Kong has remained largely unaffected until the Delta variant emerged? So was that a matter of complacency, or was it something else? Actually, there would be a lot more reasons, and as I've mentioned, quite a bit of research is still going on. But based on what we know, we could definitely do a lot better in terms of engaging with these communities, and it cannot be done, as we have seen, in the course of an outbreak. It must happen much earlier. There is a need to, as I've mentioned, guard against bias, particularly in recognizing who exactly are the worst off in society and whether this would change during an outbreak. Because, of course, when we think about the worst off in society, is not necessarily a static group. So I think that's something that will require critical reflection. But also when public health workers develop insights reports, they need to make their own positions clear because interpretations are, as we've heard from a number of our speakers, right, value driven. So what exactly are their values and how would that affect the way that they interpret the data, especially in terms of risk assessment? Not just on the part of healthcare providers, but also individuals or communities who are being cared for in that sense. So we need to think about perhaps whether there could be introduced into the system some kind of review mechanism. We have that for research. We have got ethics review board, thank you, and IRBs in place. So perhaps a similar kind of mechanism could be introduced. It need not be strict review. It could be, again, facilitated in enabling our public health workers, for example, to think through their values and to think hard about whether there might be any implicit bias. It is meant to support critical reflection, but in moving forward, in better capacitating society in responding to the next pandemic, we also need to consider ultimately the sort of interpretive resource that become available to the public at large. So ultimately, are members of the public better able to critically assess need and risk when we are confronted with another outbreak? So these are some, at least from the normative front, right? Some issues that I'd like to invite colleagues and of course participants in this conference to consider. So with this, thank you so much for your attention. And thank you. So let me move to the next presenter who will share with us on something that's quite linked. If we are to think about building in values into the design, right? Do we know, first of all, what exactly are the values and what ultimately would matter? So very happy to introduce Michelle Charlotte Liu. Thank you so much, who comes to us from the University of Ottawa in Canada. She's an engineer by background, as you'd see, but very interested to hear your thoughts on how we could draw in the values and to address some of the epistemic injustices that we already see through the use of technology in particular ways, and perhaps in a way that does not reflect any particular ethical premise, except perhaps the bottom line of a company. Yep. So thank you so much, Michelle. It's over to you.
Okay. Well, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to speak here. Everything that Calvin just said in his presentation about students and practitioners in medicine and public health, I think applies to engineers as well. So thank you, Calvin, for the perfect segue. And of course, thank you as well for grouping this set of lovely people together here into your incredibly diligent and organized team. I think we're very impressed here at the organization. So thank you to all of you. So again, my name is Michelle Liu, and I work at the intersection of law and engineering, as you just heard. And I'm about halfway through my PhD at the University of Ottawa. So I'm one of the few folks here who are not a doctor or a professor, but I'm working on it. And I'm based, as Calvin said, in Canada's national capital of Ottawa. And so being the lone engineer here, I think further compels me to share with you just a little bit more about what I think the role of engineers in the realm of health infodemic is. And so over the last 2 years, many of you, the last 2 days, we haven't been here for 2 years. Many of you have really talked lots about the different actors, right, within the infodemic and disinformation space. And you all are very tough acts to follow, but I will attempt. And so the little slice I sort of want to add, the things that all of you have said, is really just to frame engineers as being among those actors, because after all, we are the ones who actually sit down and code and build the many, many communication platforms that we've discussed. And so entrenching these ideas that you've all discussed in engineering and also getting more engineers to hear, public policy, economics, legal, and public health discussions. I think that's kind of the goal of my broader research. And that's sort of the research within which I hope to situate today's presentation. And I've heard a few people talk about the importance of science communication. And so my collaborator here, Samantha, is a trained science communicator. So I just wanted to credit her as well and to highlight that, like many projects presented here, this was an interdisciplinary collaboration. And there's a common practice in Canada now to sort of, in line with Truth and Reconciliation, to acknowledge, where we're situated. And so I just want to note that the collaboration took place between two uninvited settlers on unceded and traditional territories of various Indigenous nations who continue, of course, to grapple with the legacy of colonialism. So we've heard from, again, folks on the contexts in the US, China, Brazil, Singapore, New Zealand, Australia, the UK last night. And of course, various international organizations. And so I'm just, again, going to try to add to that list by giving just a little voice to Canada. And I say little because, that's all it gets, because we're really such a small, tiny population, I think, relative to, for example, our very mighty neighbor to the south. So I was originally from Montreal, which is, of course, the French speaking province in the French-speaking province of Quebec. But I now live in the province just west to that. For those who aren't familiar with the Canadian geography, I'm situated in Ontario, which is, of course, a largely Anglophone province. And so the reason I'm saying this is because I selected Ontario as sort of the focus of this presentation, really just as an example, given that that's the context I live in. And I think that this approach hopefully will do a good job of demonstrating how people in other jurisdictions like yourselves could prompt and carry out a similar analysis. And again, many of you have already spoken about the different ways of conceptualizing infodemic, misinformation, disinformation. So I won't dwell again on, I took out all the slides on that. I won't dwell on their definitions and framing for the 30th time, especially since my discussion hopefully is a bit more high level. Anyway, and so I'll instead use that time that I had sort of previously allotted to the definitions to get a bit deeper into discussing some engineered digital mechanisms that have enabled things like populism, disinformation, misinformation surrounding vaccines and masks. So I'll look at those two pieces as a case study, and I'll focus really on algorithmic biases, design decisions, and the lack of regulations around engineering and technology. And again, the goal here of the presentation is just to get us thinking about engineers as no longer just these creators of technology in a vacuum, no longer just, the nerds who sit in the corner and who code and who don't talk to anybody, but instead as vital players in the shaping of public discourse in our age of rapid information exchange and increasing frequencies of extreme events, as we all know, from health events to weather events. And weather events are on my mind presently because significant parts of Canada are currently on fire, quite literally. And so it's really devastating to those of us who are impacted. So like in many Commonwealth jurisdictions, including Canada, of course, the engineering discipline is professionalized and enjoys what we call an exclusive right to practice. And so this sort of privileged status brings with it responsibilities. And the profession is self-regulated by a board in each province comprised of engineers and members of the public. And I actually serve on the board of the profession in my province. And so I'm sort of generally what you would call the regulator side of engineering regulation. So this structure sort of aligns with different regulatory setups in other fields like law, medicine, accounting, and so on across Canada. And like I said, regulation occurs at the provincial level or territorial level with a total of 12 regulators overseeing the profession across Canada. Now, when you look at the demographic makeup of the engineering profession and the hegemonic trends here, you might be concerned for reasons related to the fact that technology has values, technology has politics, and both of which often, of course, depend on our different identities, social locations, perspectives, and experiences. And so I give two sets of numbers here as examples to illustrate that. And so as of 2020, in 2023, only 13% of engineers across Canada identified as female. a figure that sort of contrasts sharply with the 51% female makeup of the general Canadian population. And of course, that data is the way it's collected is a bit dated. It only considers the binary sex and of course leaves out the broader gender spectrum that we're now very tuned in with in Canada. And this trend actually extends to racial disparities as well. Taking a 2018 statistic here, 89% of engineering managers, so decision makers in engineering, were white in that year. A figure that does not at all represent the Canadian workforce, in which only 60% of people were white in that same year. And so these figures really, come together to indicate or give you a glimpse into sort of this pressing need to address and perhaps rectify the imbalances in the engineering profession, to ensure that it is, a discipline that represents and are able to serve the interests of all segments of the Canadian society and beyond. And so in that sense, I think my focus today will sort of supplement, I think, Joe's presentation and many others on the value of technology. I think I actually jotted down all the questions you presented, Joe. They were very helpful and live in my work. And so thank you for the reassurance that I'm onto something good. And I was looking at the list, and I think this talk in particular is going to touch on the question of, whose values are prioritized in these technological designs. And to that question, my argument here is that the engineering discipline made up of a very limited stratum of identities, values, and perspectives actually disproportionately contributes to advancing the values that align with those identities as opposed to being fair and equitable. And so with that, I want to zoom in on the question of, well, what are the responsibilities of engineers? What are the responsibilities of this core discipline behind, social media, as we've spoken of, behind other digital technology, both software and hardware, all of which, when put together, essentially holds more power than anything else we've ever known. And the goal in asking this question is sort of, I think, to tease out the idea that engineers and computer scientists and that broader discipline actually play a governing role in the distribution and the portrayal of information that can profoundly impact the public. And essentially tying that back to the question of, okay, engineers have an important role. What are some of the laws and policies that exist to dictate how engineers should be fulfilling this very important role? And then, of course, my broader project goal here is to identify what are the gaps in legislation, what are the gaps in policy, but that's perhaps a whole other presentation. And so here I'll focus on discussing 3 obligations that exist in the Canadian province of Ontario, as I said, and those would be the professional, ethical, and the human rights obligations. So they sort of set a bit of a boundary to what engineers can or cannot do. So engineers in Canada have professional obligations arising from provincial engineering regulatory legislation. So in Ontario, in my context, engineers' professional obligations arise partly from the statutory public interest mandate. So this law that sets out their statutory public interest mandate in the Professional Engineers Act. And so the regulatory body, the Professional Engineers Ontario, has the duty to regulate in the public interest under the statute. And it's not just the regulatory body, but the engineers themselves are deeply responsible for their primary responsibility, in fact, is to the public. And so now, despite this frequent mention of the public interest duty, there hasn't actually been a clear definition or interpretation of this duty, right? Because what does public interest mean? How would you sort of go about serving that interest? And courts and tribunals, for example, if you look at jurisprudence, seem to only have pointed to the profession's duty to serve the public, but have not actually interpreted or elaborated further on this duty. Now, in contrast, the regulator of lawyers in the same jurisdiction in Ontario has had occasion to look at this duty more carefully and has interpreted this duty to protect the public interest in deciding whether to allow. The context there was whether the law regulator should allow a conservative religious university to open a law school that would not admit students of certain identities. And so the regulator of lawyers here, relying on its duty to protect the public interest, to include, they interpreted it to include maintaining equal access to the legal profession, diversity within the bar, and the bar is what we call the legal profession, and preventing harm to differently identified law students. And that was something that was affirmed by the Supreme Court, which is the apex court of Canada, that all of these elements in the interpretation were well within the scope of the regulator's duty to uphold the public interest. So that sort of gave rise to the idea that professional engineering regulatory bodies could consider this interpretation of the duty to protect the public interest in essentially attenuating the bias and inequity in the technology that engineers create. So the second one here, the ethical component. And so many of you have talked about ethics and ethical obligations and many other actors in the health, infodemic and public health space. And so engineers as well have ethical obligations arising from the normative discourse on engineering ethics, including topics on the politics and sociology of technology and the impact of values on technological designs. So my argument here is that engineers conceivably fail to meet these ethical obligations when they view their work as neutral, which is a word that came up quite a bit yesterday, and objective and neutral, despite engineering problems, of course, having the tendency to have, for example, numerous solutions and require engineers to select or recommend which they perceive to be the best. And so the way I sort of like to frame it is that I think the work of an engineer has two dimensions, right? So the understanding of the scientific and mathematical component is the more objective and value-free dimension. For example, engineers, would compute that 1 + 1 = 2. That concept is not at dispute, right? That's not typically up for debate between, differently identified or situated people, for example. Whereas exercising judgment as to which scientific and mathematical principles or models to apply and what constraints to impose in the application and what criteria, for example, to use in selecting the solution to put forward among many other engineering processes, that's to me the more subjective dimension. And that's the dimension that is sensitive to values and identities and perspectives. And that's the dimension in which ethical frameworks should play a key role. And so the value sensitive dimension here includes, again, just to get deeper into that, I think includes selecting constraints or trade-offs in the application of a model or a code. And these constraints might include things like cost, time, regulation, safety, and more. And so I think, again, as Joe Marcello and a couple other speakers have alluded to, we must focus on the fact that these choices are non-neutral, but are instead deeply entrenched with values and value-based assumptions. And the lack of this recognition present in engineering makes the engineer unethical, because the engineer would be creating socially failed, biased, and inequitable technology. So the third piece of the obligations here arise from the human rights legislation. And so engineers in Canada, I argue, have obligations to promote and uphold equity and inclusion, and those principles, and that sort of is codified within provincial and federal human rights legislation. So in the Ontario context, again, just to continue with the Ontario example, the Human Rights Code enumerates several protected grounds. It's a very long list, but it includes citizenship, race, place of origin, ethnic origin, color, ancestry, disability, age, creed, sex, family status, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and of course, receipt of public assistance and any criminal record or record of offenses. So these are the protected grounds on which the Human Rights Code prohibits professional practitioners like engineers from discriminating against somebody based on these grounds, right? So you can't say, well, I don't want to provide the best service possible to this person because of their gender, because they're disabled, or because of their age. And that's sort of the protection around the provision of services, as well as in the preparation of a contract and in their employment decisions around hiring and who gets promoted and so on. And here the Human Rights Code here makes pretty clear that the failure to address these, formal or substantive inequality or discrimination, if you will, may constitute, in fact, a violation of the code. And so in other words, providing engineering services and providing a design that better serves some groups than others could be considered a violation of this code, which could mean that engineers' human rights obligations would include, for example, the need to ensure that members of the public experience an environment free of barriers, are able to use facial recognition programs that work equally well for all skin tones, as opposed to, as they currently are, favoring white and Caucasian faces. And so engineers who fail to apply these principles could actively be creating barriers between members of the public and education, healthcare, transportation, public spaces, and of course, all forms of technologies that we've discussed here in the last 2 days, thereby meaning that the technology they create may be in violation of their human rights obligations. The way I structure the presentation is sort of, to frame the obligation versus reality. As I just spoke to the obligations, now I want to get into sort of what the reality on the ground is and how well or not engineers are meeting these obligations. And so we know how far we have to go in marrying the obligations with the reality. So when we look at, the infodemic, for example, around COVID-19, existing methods to mitigate the spread of mis and disinformation were and are often ineffective, as many of you have discussed in great detail, because both of the novel content of the misinformation as well as the new role of technology, internet capabilities, and social media, and so on. And so I want to use sort of two fundamental public health concerns, those being vaccines and mask wearing, as a case study to get us thinking about engineers' role in the design and creation of social media, which again is one of the primary technological tools that, again, as we've discussed, enables the dissemination of disinformation. So as a result of changing internet capabilities and evolving capabilities, information surrounding health information, including bad information around vaccines and masks, have really evolved and changed in sort of three principal ways, I think. And so first, in its origin, so where information comes from and who is the voice of knowledge. And secondly, it's the nature of the information. So with the inclusion of more subjective, and emotional stories and personal stories surrounding vaccines. And we saw the photo of I think it was Isabella that showed the photo of a girl, rest in peace. Those sorts of emotionally charged stories surrounding vaccination, often, of course, with very serious side effects around uptakes of vaccines and so on. And lastly, of course, the speed at which information is shared has been quickly evolving as well. So essentially, where we are now is that the web provides this free and always available and anonymously accessible information, that empowers patients and insights then to contribute to their own health-related decisions. And so we see that social media has really fueled a culture of consumer autonomy in relation to healthcare, where users are not only able to, but encouraged, in fact, to do their own research, figure out their own sort of, where they want to begin and so on, share their stories and opinions, and explore topics like vaccinations and masks before actually making a decision to undertake those or not. So while other psychological and sociological factors play a really important role in the spread of misinformation and disinformation through social media, the digital and engineered mechanisms of these online platforms are equally influential, and again, I argue must be studied in parallel and merit its own focus. And so these engineered mechanisms include the three that I want to discuss here, which are platform design, algorithmic biases, and technological regulation or the lack thereof. So the very nature of social media, is designed to be more interactive and act as this two-way information exchange that involves the user asking questions and conducting their own research. And so social media in that sense is designed, engineered, in fact, to be low cost, easy access, and fast information dissemination, resulting in more people consuming information, news, and science or health content from all forms of social media and other platforms as compared to more traditional outlets that require, for example, peer review and editors and so on in the case of journals. And so these social media platforms attributes are remarkably similar to those that allow disinformation to thrive, And the repetition, for example, required for disinformation to stick is inadvertently designed into social media by engineers who want to make sure that their platforms use quick, frequent scrolling, and repetitive exposure to messages within a social media feed, for example, the scrolling phenomenon. Everyone's just sitting there and scrolling, right? So when we see information that agrees with us more often while doing that scrolling, especially within the information overload on social media, when there's just so much, you could scroll for hours and absorb, the amount of content that would normally be present in a book or a textbook, for example, that triggers this psychological phenomenon of what we know as confirmation bias, where you favor something that you already know and agree with. So then simplified sharing mechanisms like that on social media platforms really motivate us to share that this information and misinformation quickly before even fact checking or making sure that it's coming from a reliable source, for example. So in the context of vaccination and mask misinformation, disinformation during the COVID-19 pandemic, people primarily shared those bad information because they failed to sufficiently think about whether or not the content is accurate when deciding what to share, when to share it. And this inattention and to these details is fueled by design and by the design of social media share functions that are, again, part of the engineering design of social media and why they've been so successful. And so the share function as well allows this information to circulate globally, right? One click, it's out there. And so, for example, a false claim from a US governor's chief medical officer tweet banning the use of hydroxychloroquine treatments spread within minutes throughout North America and South America. And so social media was designed as a concept to share personal and emotional stories. And this unintentionally leads to users avoiding more technical, right? It enables the avoidance of more technical and difficult to absorb information like scientific evidence and information. And people avoid those in favor of the inflammatory and appeals to emotion found in this information. And so as users, we've been trained, right, through that repetitive exposure to approach social media with this mindset that's biased by emotion, and this cognitive bias in turn reduces our tendency to question or verify the information that we receive. And so in this way, social media is designed by engineers relying on these psychological phenomenon to exploit the social cognition and cognitive biases, and thereby creating a breeding ground for that disinformation. And so on top of all of that, social media has been designed for quick, limited messaging, right? Through controlled word counts, for example, as we saw from Marcia's presentation, I think, where she discussed in Brazil, there's only, for many people, their internet is just these platforms where they have a limited, messaging capabilities. And so, for example, the character count on Twitter, if your only access to social media is Twitter, the socially acceptable lengths or the allowable lengths of posts is really limited compared to, health or science websites or even, governmental websites with mandatory peer reviewers, editors, scientific evidence. Compared to that, the language used on social media must be simple, short, to fit into the word count and character counts that are designed. And this design feature limits the possibility for scientific nuance and vital health details, often leading to, again, the inaccurate simplification of legitimate data, either in favor of exaggerated clickbait or true distortion into disinformation. So we see an example of this here. In 2020, The Telegraph, which is a UK news source, tweeted an article with the post, "New coronavirus mutation could be evolving to get around mask wearing and hand washing." Right? So this, of course, we all know, ultimately became unsupported. It's not a good claim. Cited to a preprint article, but focused on a distorted quote from one author from the article on a personal opinion, not a topic that was actually covered by the preprint. And so the nuance and scientific detail was lost in favor of this catchy sentence, catchy topic that would fit, again, see how short that tweet is, that would fit the word counts and the emotional demand of social media. And so this is an outcome, again, of engineering choices, right? Choices to create a platform, a code, or an algorithm that would achieve this end. So the most common design attribute of social media platforms is the algorithm that offers selective exposure to information based on personalized user interests and needs of the users. And so this algorithm drives content, right? Feeds you content and forms homogenous clusters of people, right? Instead of, bringing together diverse thoughts and diversely situated people, it actually has the opposite effect. It actually drives different people apart and creates these homogenous clusters of people, content, and information that we know, of course, as echo chambers. And so a 2021 study here visualized these echo chambers in this scatter diagram. And the study looked at the impact of echo chambers based on retweets and connections between and within these super communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I won't have time to go into depth about this research, but it was really interesting. And I thought it was a good way to get a sense of how powerful echo chambers can be and how quickly they can increase self-amplification and polarization via, again, engineered platforms. And this was what we saw throughout the entire COVID-19 timeline. So these echo chambers are built as a direct result of recommender algorithms, right? They trap physically users into personalized information by using their past behaviors to tailor recommendations to their preferences. And so the engineering of these algorithms constantly create and refine a theory of who you are and what you will do and want next, reducing those into a code and trapping you into this self-reinforcing pattern. And the direct result then of echo chambers is this narrower self-interest, overconfidence, decreased motivation to learn, and of course, a polarization of thought. And so in a study of vaccine hesitant Facebook pages, commonly referred to as anti-vax or anti-vaccination groups, researchers found that these pages were highly representative of echo chambers. They were essentially echo chambers in the form of a Facebook group. And so users develop patterns of activity and involvement across multiple pages, filling their feed with this filter of anti-vaccination sentiments and stories of practice of anti-vaccination. And so similarly, during the pandemic, a single major group emerged on Twitter with interests in scientific and health topics and a highly international distribution of users. Now, the scientific health super community played a major role in disseminating COVID-19 information during the beginning of the pandemic. But despite that, the existence of that scientific group, as community self-amplification and polarization increased as a product of echo chambers, this echo chamber effect eventually and very quickly overpowered any potential role that the scientific and health and evidence-based community could ever play. And so while the built infrastructure and embedded algorithms of social media create breeding grounds for disinformation, the role of engineers, right, again, going back to the role of engineers, does not end once the platforms are developed, as we sort of can discern from what I've been speaking about. And so ongoing attempts at regulation and updates to existing designs are necessary because they have the potential to play a vital role in the use and impact of social media, whether in extreme and emergency health events and beyond. Unfortunately, many of the main social media sites, including Meta, who's the host of Facebook and Instagram, Twitter or X and WhatsApp and so on, consider themselves platforms of free expression and not publishers of content, thereby resulting in this reluctancy to moderate the content themselves. And so regardless of this, pressure from external parties has resulted in attempts at regulation. And so in 2020, for example, Facebook, as you can see here, announced the regulation of their algorithms to filter misinformation in response to the pandemic, including decreasing the algorithmic ranking of posts flagged by internal fact checkers. That's a minor attempt. Now, participants of a research study on this expressed actually distrust in fact checkers. So the people who are supposed to check for facts actually received a lower trust. I'm running out of time here, but I'll quickly wrap up this slide. This is the last slide. And so overall, there are these weak results that flagging misinformation or correction can actually successfully mitigate the impact of this information. And as we saw in that study, it might in fact have the opposite effect. Another example here, the popular platform of WhatsApp, for example, was originally designed with a one-touch share of information to 250 different followers. And this allowed for very quick dissemination of information to large audiences without fact-checking or any regulation. And so in fact, there's an increased share of this information on WhatsApp when compared to Twitter due to that design feature. And this design choice, again, an engineering choice, was limited to a one-touch share of information to only 5 different followers in 2019 as a result of a regulation tactic. So there's some hope. And again, lastly, during the COVID-19 pandemic, platforms in their response and transparency, 2 types of content prohibited content, and different criteria guiding public responses to fact-checking inquiries, just overall strategic approaches to combat misinformation. These are things that we've seen. So there again is a trend toward some amount of regulation. But then at the same time, this made it difficult for policymakers, researchers, and the general public to kind of understand and constructively critique how social media was regulating the secondary, epidemic or infodemic of disinformation. And so the takeaway then with that, to bridge that divide is really, don't forget the engineers. I think the role of social media and how engineers influence this platform and beyond, I think must be factored into future planning for pandemic preparedness as a vital part of social and public health. So again, the four words I hope to leave all of you with is don't forget the engineers. And I'll look forward to discussing further here or on any of these platforms with anyone who wishes to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Michelle. So we're right now going to do a deep dive into looking at the situation in Vietnam, media monitoring, as well as broader responses to COVID-19. Very privileged right now to be joined by Professor Mary Chambers. Professor Chambers, sorry to keep you waiting. We are getting your presentation slides up, and as you see from the conference booklet, Professor Chambers has done immense work on media monitoring across a number of jurisdictions, including Vietnam. So we will be hearing and learning from her some insights from media monitoring, and as well as some of the concerns that we have to think about, particularly as an ethics guidance document is being developed, and also in terms of better preparing ourselves for the next pandemic if one should come. So, Professor Chambers, can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay, it's clearly received at our end. Thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you very much for the kind invitation to what has been a very interesting meeting so far. And I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but I've been really enjoying the presentations. So the talk that I'm going to give today is about an engagement project rather than an academic research piece or a philosophical or ethical approach to the use of media monitoring and social listening. And I hope this gives an idea of how we've used this media monitoring in a very pragmatic way. So I'll start by giving a very brief introduction to the research unit that I work in and the SPEAR project that was the context for this work. And I'll talk briefly through the media monitoring methods that we used, the aims of our engagement, and some examples of rapid public engagement responses from the sites. So I work at the Oxford University Clinical Research Asia program. I'm based in Ho Chi Minh City, where the mothership, so to speak, is based, and we're hosted by the Hospital for Tropical Diseases. We've had a research unit there for almost 30 years. And there's a smaller unit in Hanoi and Jakarta in Indonesia. And recently, Okru, Nepal has become its own entity, but is still part of our program. So the Okru mission is to do biomedical research on infectious diseases that are important in the countries that we work in. And we do this with the aim of influencing policy, practice, and to achieve better health outcomes for the communities that we work in. But included in all of our research approaches is a public and community engagement, which we see as two-way partnerships with the communities that we work with. So just to continue my introduction, in early 2020, as the pandemic started to spread in Southeast Asia, we developed a collaborative social science research proposal to explore the impacts of COVID-19 on health workers. And then in the second phase on barriers to access and uptake of COVID-19 vaccines. The SPEAR study was run in 3 countries, in Nepal, Indonesia, in Vietnam, in 12 sites, and with a research team of almost 50 people. We use both qualitative and quantitative research methods. But my part in this was that we integrated public engagement approaches such as participatory visual methods, or as we called it for the project, digital diaries, and also a media monitoring, in order to get a much deeper sense of the impact of COVID-19 on the communities that we're working with. So the aim of this particular project was to monitor social media and mainstream news to identify fake news and misinformation, but also to listen to the concerns of the public in order to help us develop a targeted and rapid public engagement response. The project had 2 phases. The first phase, we kicked off the ground almost as soon as we heard that the pandemic, that the infection was spreading and it was becoming a pandemic status. So in late January 2020, and it ran until June. It was a very short time frame because we received funding from the University of Oxford in their Rapid Response Fund, which was just until June. And then we set up a second phase of monitoring from January 2021 that ran for 12 months. So across the 3 countries, we use common search terms. In the first phase, these were around COVID-19, corona, and then using local terms for each country. And the second phase, we use search terms around vaccines, and then the names of specific vaccines that were available in the countries that we were working with, but also phrases around variants and side effects. So as I mentioned, this was a very pragmatic approach to the media monitoring, and slightly different in each of the sites. The teams did manual searches. We also used community-based surveillance, and by this I mean that we asked our contacts, we asked our social media followers to report or forward on any news items that fitted our criteria. We used Google search and platform search engines to sift through mainstream news and social media. And this is a list of some of the online news platforms that we monitored in each of the 3 countries. So once an item of news or social media post was identified as being of interest, we've had it verified by an expert that it was in fact misinformation or disinformation. And then each news item was categorized into one of these categories. In phase 1, the categories included prevention, treatment, government management. And in phase 2, they were around vaccine hesitancy, side effects, but also distrust of the medical system as well. So, as well as trying to identify fake news, we also wanted to understand the concerns of our community. So we monitored social media for common circulating narratives. This graph here, which is from the first 8 months of the pandemic, show that there were very different dynamics in the 3 countries that we were working in. So Vietnam had just over 1,000 cases in August 2020, whereas Indonesia was looking at over 150,000 cases within the same time frame. So despite these differences, there were some of the main themes that were common in all of the countries. Some of the differences, for example, in Vietnam, there was a lot of community talk or chatter about the quarantine and testing. This second list shows the key themes or issues that arose during the second phase of our monitoring. And again, there were differences between the sites. For example, in Indonesia, early on in the pandemic, there were concerns that the Sinovac vaccine wasn't halal. In Nepal, some of the concerns were around vaccines donated by India as being suboptimal. And then later in all of the countries, there were concerns around side effects and very specifically about whether pregnant women or children were able to take the vaccine. So now I'll go on to the second part of my talk, which is really how we use this media monitoring to inform our engagement responses. So we had very country and context specific responses, and we were able to respond within a very short time frame. We also aimed to identify gaps in the available public health information that was circulating in the languages of each country and tried to meet some of those needs. We informed our engagement approach by some of the lessons and reflections from the Ebola outbreak. And in particular, this paper by Blair et al. And the guidelines from WHO, which really highlighted the need for dialogue, transparency, for collaboration. And thirdly, I think this is really important, by the empowering of communities by the transfer of knowledge. So we tried to create opportunities that promoted and enabled dialogue with experts and researchers. And obviously much of this engagement had to move online. For some of these events, we partnered with organizations that had a much wider and bigger reach than our own. So for example, the UK Embassy in Vietnam, or in Indonesia, the Conversation newspaper, and they partnered with us to host our events. We also chose media platforms that our target audiences were using in each setting, and there was definitely not a one-size-fits-all method. So, for example, the team in Indonesia developed a podcast series largely for the tech-savvy Jakarta audience, whereas on Sumba Island, which is another one of our research communities, it's a very rural community, and they used a radio program. In Nepal, the team utilized an existing community group chat with tens of thousands of members on a Viber platform in order to really facilitate dialogue and connecting the community with experts. At some points during the pandemic, we were able to have face-to-face meetings. So early on in the pandemic, the Nepal team ran what they call tea talks, which were public talks for the community to meet scientists. In Vietnam, we ran a number of workshops for young people, for students, on identifying fake news, really to try and help them make better decisions about where they were finding information. And as I said, in Eastern Indonesia, in rural areas, all of our engagement had to be face-to-face. So as well as events that enable dialogue, we also wanted to create evidence-based public health messages, which were informed by the media that we were monitoring. So where we found fake news or misinformation circulating, we aim to counter that with evidence-based messages. And And here's just some examples from the 3 countries. And finally, we also use social media to try and answer common community concerns and to speak to those common circulating narratives. When there were many questions and concerns around vaccine side effects, we created YouTube videos and Facebook posts. And I just want to highlight this one video on the left, which was actually created by one of our research doctors. And within a few months, it had over 2 million views and then was included by the Ministry of Health in Vietnam as their top 10 COVID information posts. And just in conclusion, we did evaluate the reach of our engagement. As I said, this was a very pragmatic project, and we took a light touch to our evaluation, but we used some analytics to understand how the reach and the impact of our social media. We also tried to collect comments from listeners and people joining our events. And then I think in conclusion, although it was quite time consuming and human resource heavy, we felt that media monitoring really helped us to understand in real time the concerns and the sentiments that were circulating in the communities that we were working amongst, and therefore helped us to rapidly design public engagement that could speak directly to those concerns. I just want to acknowledge the wider team that was involved with this project and my funders. So thank you. And I hope that leaves time for some questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Professor Chambers. Everyone, do join me in thanking Professor Chambers for her presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to introduce Hai, whom some of you would have met. He's currently a PhD student in the University of Ottawa, working in the area of law and bioethics. And he's going to speak to us also about Vietnam and the application of the precautionary principle. Of course, it's a principle that is well recognized in international law. So with this, Hai, welcome, and the floor is yours. You've got slides as well.
Hello. Thank you very much, Professor Calvin, and it's a great honor for me to be here. It's a really exciting and insightful conference that I learned a lot, and it did have me to reflect many of my thinking about current and ongoing disaster and pandemic and something related to health, which is very beneficial to my project. And I also take this opportunity to express many efforts of academics, practitioners in Vietnam and elsewhere, of the government's engineers who dedicate a lot to prevent and control and contribute to better life of people. So today I will talk about some Vietnamese cases and the recursive principle. I will try to translate some legalist jurisprudence into policy recommendation with a view to helping social listening. The structure of my presentation today is that I will first start with some cases, very brief, and then I argue that the recursive principle is one of the principles of health governance. It's also be very brief, and then I will talk about certain benchmark or conditions for being precaution. So I will first start with a case. I think many of us here have mentioned that, yeah, actually for health governance, this is crucial to pick some noise, to listen to some noise, to figure out some signal. And then we will see that actually it's very hard, to have a purely very perfect sounds that we can recognize the signal. And experience is that in the past, the way in which we can figure out, we can detect a disaster is from certain noises, but not a very perfect sound. For example, if we recall the COVID-19 pandemic, and if we recall Dr. Liu Wenlang, a Chinese hero, we'll see that, some information he leaked online in some private group, and then is circulate radically in some group and then elsewhere in the community. This is not a very perfect information. Like he told it's a SARS, but it turned out to be a SARS-CoV-2. So it's very hard to tell out, like, is this really correct or not? But I think it's still a point for government and governance to engage with certain kind of information like that. That's the first cases. Another case is I think also related to our discussion about how we can respond to criticism of policy, management strategy. For example, in Vietnam, although they do very well, but in some instance, they try to, respond to criticism of quarantine or of some public health social measure, like if you against the strategy, so you do not value human life, or you act against the country, and so I think it's a quite simplified and some quite rigid and very inflexible message. And so we recall that the situation during the pandemic changed very rapidly, so we need certain kind of flexibility. And also, as I have discussed with you yesterday and the day before yesterday, this is something very pattern. A pattern can be observed in many emergency, but not solely with COVID-19 pandemic. The third case is about how we can see a policy can influence human behavior. For example, I recall one very famous corruption cases in Vietnam related to the manufacture of the COVID-19 kit. The government actually some corrupted official, they engaged with the manufacturer of test kits, and they announced with the public that, well, this test kit is very high quality product and is accepted by the WHO and some European institution. But, many people know that it's not sure, it's not correct. But the information from the government and the way with certain official, they respond with people result in the situation in which people cannot, express their concern, cannot tell the truth. And then only 2 years after the pandemic, when everything passed, so it has been exposed that, well, some criticism of the people is true that the test case is, not quite high product. So it's about the case I mentioned first to give you a sense of what happened, and we may need very critical thinking of policy and where should we engage with people and policy. So then I argue, then the next section of my presentation is that I argue that the Precautionary principle is a foundation concept of public health governance. I will be very brief. I will not argue why it is so, but actually I just descriptively mentioned that, well, it is presented in many international instruments. Sub-law, hard law, and some policy document you may see within the context of European states, the UK and Vietnam. There's many formulations of recursive principles that result in very heated debate of what it is, whether it is sensible or whether it's reasonable to be called recursive, being recursion. So also not engage too much with the discussion here, because this talk will be more about policy recommendation, so that I capture the criticism, the discussion, the debate in terms of risk. You may see if we really follow the policy principle in the sense that, well, we will go to the extreme of every issue, so it will result in the fact that we will see that, as some of you recognize, that actually the virus live a long period than us human beings, and us human beings live in a viral sphere, live in a space of risk everywhere around us, risk. And then the two situations related to the recursory principle that is really straight up. If we try to, avoid certain risk, then we might have problem with another kind of risk. Or if we know, I will not take this risk and I will do nothing, so it's kind of paralysis, but still it will result in certain risk. If you do not think so, there's risk as well. So in response to this various discussion about recursion principle and how to really be recursion, so there needs to be certain benchmark for, well, understand what really recursion is. And for years, jurisprudence throughout the world have defined what is this precautionary, meaning precaution principle. So first, there's certain controversy whether precaution principle is against risk analysis. But just speaking, jurisprudence around the world say no, it's not that. The recursive principle cannot detach itself from rational and risk analysis. For example, in the PISA case, ECJ, the European Court of Justice, recognized that the recursive principle cannot probably be based on purely hypothetical approach. There must be a risk assessment to assess the degree of probability of certain product or procedure having adverse effect and the seriousness of any such adverse effect. The competent authority must ensure that any measure that it takes are based on thorough scientific risk assessment, if possible. Scientific advice must be based on principal excellence, independent, and transparency. And I also recall the EC hormone of the WTO say that risk does it to be evaluated is not only risk acceptable in certain laboratory operating under strictly controlled conditions, but also risk in human society as the actual exists. In other words, the actual potential for the effect on human health is a real world where people live and work and die. And so, and I recall for vaccination, if we tend to rely on hypothetical concerns, so we can go nowhere, and it may result in more risk because if we cannot deny vaccine or vaccination upon certain adverse effect and certain merely hypothetical concern, so there must be a way out. And so I think in this regard, social listening can be very important tool, to understand what risk really is in a real world where we live and die. But there's an issue here. If we say that the risk assessment must be very thorough, must be very excellent. So there's a situation in which is, if you recall the COVID-19 pandemic, we will first do not have so many information, there's so many uncertainty about what really happened here and there and what really the implication of policy of government. And so is it true that in the case in which the information is insufficient, so we cannot do anything? And so there's another aspect of the recursive principle is it allows certain measure to be interim and to be provisional. For example, in the BSE case, the ECJ applied that where the uncertainty is to existence of the extent of risk to human health, institution may take protective measure without having to wait until the reality of seriousness of the risk being fully apparent. And in Japan, Apple, WHO applied that measure can be applied where information necessary for risk assessment is insufficient. So, and if we recognize that certain measure in the state of uncertainty or in the state of insufficient is provisional, we should also recognize that, the measure must be provisional in nature, that they must be reviewed periodically. They should not be permanent. They should be, more information should be required for more and better assessment. So this relate to the next aspect of precautionary principle is we have period assessment, progressive development in science. In this regard, social listening can serve as input for period review of provisional measure. We may know there's certain concern of what it is, so we will take assessment, and then with assessment and take measure, and there's certain concern, we will review the measure and see, what to refine, what to do next. This is the way around, but not everything, as you may correctly say, not all things start from the scratch, so we may learn, adapt from the past, and this is also an aspect of precautionary principle. And it is the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, in some instance recognized that the establishment of certain expert government is for the sake of better understand of risk and certain understand of the uncertainty nature of certain issue. So you may see it's a constant learning process and constant process of refine and define measure. There's an interesting issue here. If we say that, measure can be provisional in the step, so insufficient information. So the question is, what is the ratio of measure? Is this like state and government can do whatever they want, they deem fit, it is in the name of certain high good. And in this regard, the EC in hormone case also applied authority can be sometimes more cautious than international community. And it is not bounded by opinion of scientists, but it's not in the mean that it can disregard any opinion of scientists. But in order to disregard opinion of scientists, it must rely itself on other part of opinion of that group of scientists or other credible sources of information from scientists. So it's about, to prevent kind of arbitrariness in decision making. And a way also to prevent arbitrariness is by the use of model of data. For example, if you want to better refine measure, if you really want to learn from the past, so you have some data, some information from the past, some model, some institution for oversight what really happened and decide what to do next. And here international agreement, they mention measures should be effective, should be cost benefit, but I don't think cost benefit analysis is the only model in this regard. And there's certain ways in which we can more model and more tool can come into place to have decision maker. But if we recall that the necessity of model of data and of the necessity of effective measure of cost benefits, cost effective measure, we should recognize that the way in which we deploy this tool this measure must be also subject to assessment to see whether is it better for us to use the tool in that time or not, or use that model at all. Because as you mentioned about infodemic, if you use model to collect data, but it will result in too much data, it will burden decision maker for sure. But in some certain case, not only burden decision maker, but burden with someone who enforces the policy. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, in response to the contact tracing approach, actually the contact tracing approach is very sensible during the first wave of the pandemic, where the cases are slow, not many cases. But in the climate, is a boom of cases, many cases. So if we continue with certain tool previously we used, it will result in distress of healthcare worker, and they should have do other things like healthcare support for patient rather than contact tracing at that time. In this regard, resources should be fluently used and recurrently used, and attempt to collect data should be sensible. They should not be, excessive and temporarily or especially inappropriate or imprudent. And it does not make sense, to use certain resources on certain activity in some time, but it's sometimes sensible to use it in different time. So attempt to use social listening as a tool similar to any other tool that it should be fluently used, should be used recurrently, so resources should not be used quite excessively. For example, in this regard, a Vietnamese experience is that when the pandemic comes, many agencies come into develop tool of app for contact tracing, for health declaration, many things other else, and they are overlap each other to resolve ways of resources. So in this regard, is need cooperation and coordination. The final aspect I want to mention is about risk communication related to the cases mentioned above. You may see if we it is really vital to ensure that communication is flexible, because otherwise we can chill people from express their opinion, and it can result in like people cannot report their concern, and so we cannot listen at all. So this inhibit communication. In this regard, I think an interdisciplinary approach to issue may be a path, may be demanded. We may need a guidance in relation to good practice in social listening and risk communication. We may need a wide indication for law and policy is that we should facilitate an environment in which people feel they are not threatened in lodging concern, claim, or policy recommendation. We may ensure that input to policy are collected on equitable and inclusive and diverse basis, because like if we just also listen to a certain group in internet, well, that group may be, empowered by certain power of the internet, certain power from the government, something like that. So it's just about listening to certain group again and again. It's kind of echo in the room, so I don't think it's good. So for precaution, we should broaden the scope of listening. I don't think another issue. I don't think that it makes sense at all to make to shame other people or to make a distinction between us and them. We may need sometimes we will need respectful disagreement. Yeah, but we should not, you and me are different entity. And I think further research concern optimal pattern of risk communication can be demanded if we recall that we live in a situation with there are many uncertainty. We may really wonder was it the appropriate manner in which we can respond. We can communicate the risk. For example, like, is it better to say, well, there's no evidence, or we say, well, the evidence currently support that there's a disastrous risk that will coming. I'm not so sure in this regard with pattern is better, but we will need further research in this regard. And I'm recall your presentation yesterday from Professor Kevin Tung and Justin. I feel very enthusiastic and very exciting, like engaged with certain policy that can influence. I mean, for Singapore, they counter misinformation by communication, and they also interact with the motivation behind certain communication like financial support. So I think it's a one way, it's a good thing. And for Justin, I learned from her, well, there's certain ways which you can design a very attractive tool to engage, to encourage people to do things without compel them to do so. And I really appreciate many effort from different sides to solve the issue. So in conclusion, I argue that the precautionary principle is one of the foundational concepts of health governance, and it's also a benchmark for the activity as well. And you may see the logic is more rounded, like there is risk assessment, revisional measure, and then reassessment. And there are certain spaces for change, for redefine, and to better learn and redefine measure. Thank you. And sorry if my presentation is not very well prepared. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Hi. Of course, this is a hugely important area on gender and the impact on social listening. So I'm delighted to introduce, I think she's probably the only health economist in this group at our meeting this time. So welcome, Dr. Deepshika Patija. So Deepshika is a research fellow at One Health Trust in Bengaluru, India. And the example that she's going to share with us is, of course, deeply embedded in the context of India. In fact, very interesting studies that she's going to share with us, highlighting why we need to foreground gender-related concerns. So with this warm welcome, Deepshika, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Calvin, for inviting us all for this engaging discussion. And I know we are quite at the end of the conference, and you guys have been very patient, and I hope you will bear with me as I am the second last speaker of this conference. So thank you so much again, Calvin. So my presentation is on implications of gender inequities on social listening in public health. This work has been assisted by Shrishti Goel, who's also working with Calvin and me on our work in AMR. So we've gone through the definitions of social listening for the last 2 days. So I'm not going to talk about the definition really, but I want to just reiterate that it is an integration of information from both online and offline sources. However, a rapid literature review from WHO uncovered that most social listening related literature has focused on social media listening when it comes to public health and infodemic management. However, SL still does not cater to a large section of the population that does not have access to social media or the internet. UN data has highlighted that 37% of the world's population does not have access to the internet, including women and socioeconomic minorities in LMICs, ethnic minorities in developed countries, and a lot of the disadvantaged population that Kirsten was talking about yesterday in her presentation. So just to This is an image of a woman that I met last week during my field work in this village in Chikbalapur district in Karnataka. The survey, this was a pilot testing on a survey which was on indoor air pollution, women's health, not on social media. But I saw that this woman had tucked away a phone in her sari, so I asked her about it. And there were all these other women who had gathered around to also talk to us. And so as you can see, this phone is not data enabled. It's a basic phone, which is, of course, she's very happy. She was happily showing it to me. But many of her friends did not have a phone, even forget a data-enabled phone, but a basic phone. And when I asked them, they said they could not use a mobile phone, so therefore they did not possess one. So it's not just about it's about education and income, and of course, and I will come to the whole structure of how socio-cultural gender norms might be further perpetuating these inequities. This is, I'm just showing you some data on mobile gender gaps in mobile ownership and gender gap in mobile internet usage. And as you can see, these gaps are pretty glaring in Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot in South Asian countries. So these gaps in just mobile ownership have been, even though they have been reducing, they're still at 19%. And for mobile internet usage, it has been declining over the last couple of years, but still the gender gap is at 36%. So there are these pre-existing socio-cultural norms in low and middle income countries which create gaps in education and perceived acceptability of women using phones, which has led to a glaring gap in digital access and engagement with social media as an information source. Across LMICs, women are 15% less likely to use data-enabled smartphone, and significantly lesser women use the internet to find health information. South Asian countries such as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh have some of the world's highest gender gaps in technology, as I showed you in the previous slide. And this possibly, so we have to understand why are these women left out of the digital network, as you know, our ecosystem. It's possibly due to gender discrimination and prevalence of adverse socio-cultural norms in these countries. Men are therefore more likely to have access to health information, but also misinformation. However, men are the primary decision makers in the household. So we have to, when we think about individual decision making in health, we have to think about who has the power to make decisions. So men have more access to mobile phones and therefore information, both information and misinformation, but they're also making most of these decisions about health in their family, because they are in these patriarchal setups, male members are mostly the heads of the households. So some data from DHS data, which is also called NFHS in India, and this is recent data, only 10% of women make independent decisions about their own health, while 71% make joint decisions with their spouse. The rest, 19%, do not make decisions about their own health. For men, this figure is, for men, it's 33% of men make independent decisions about their own health, and 56% make joint decisions with their spouse. Because these health decisions in families with very strong family ties like we have in India, of course, decisions are made within families, but only 11% of men don't make decisions about their health, their own health, versus 19% of women. So this is a very significant difference. This is all about the demand side. But when we talk about the supply side, which has often not been discussed, Michelle brought it up today in her discussion, there's evidence that highlights a huge shortage of women in STEM workforce. Only, if we look at the STEM workforce worldwide, only 28% of it is female. So, which implies that most social media platforms are primarily handled by men, and most apps created for women are also made by men. So, of course, the implications of this are yet to be tested, because this is something which is just being talked about now. So, the implication of this we have not been tested yet. So, before I go on to talk about my own work, I would just give you a little preview. I know a lot of us are already aware of this, but a short preview of what are these social norms and how do they impact the health system and create differential gender differences in health outcomes for men versus women. So as an individual is born, as an infant is born with some biological endowments of genes, body features, genitalia, and hormones, they are immediately immersed into this gender system where they interact with family, institutions, community, and structures and policies which create and reinforce and instill norms. And then this also interacts with other power structures and privileges, such as the gendered, and creates a gendered social position. So these power structures may be race, class, age, and ability. All this, along with biology, it all creates gender differences in exposure, gendered differences in gendered health behaviors, differences in gendered impacts on access to care, gender bias health system, gender bias health research institutions, and data collection. And this, together with biology and this whole gender system, creates gender inequities in outcomes. And of course, when I'm talking about gender here, I have mostly been talking about men and women, but we have to think about other gender as well. Unfortunately, we don't have data. So for most part of my presentation, even though in this slide I'm talking about other genders, LGBTQIA plus communities, but going forward, I will be talking mostly about men and women. So how do these social norms, and not to be confused with like norms which are like legal rules and norms. These are socio-cultural norms. How do these social cultural norms influence health outcomes for women? So I'm going to talk about specific norms and how they interact with the legal policy and health systems to further perpetuate gender inequities. So there are social norms about domestic care responsibilities. Time use data from across the globe shows that women are the primary caregivers in households. So then they are more prone to infections. They are not going out to work. There are also social norms about suitable jobs for men and women. For example, teaching is supposed to be a suitable job for women. So what this creates is that most women are then trapped into low promotable, low paying jobs. So this leads to poor health outcomes because health is costly. There are social norms stigmatizing menstruation in many countries. There are social norms about ownership and control of physical and financial assets. Now, a lot of the bargaining power and agency is tied to earned income. And if women are not allowed to go out and there are these restrictions on their physical mobility, so that they don't go out and intermingle with outside men for purity reasons. So this leads to women not having earned income, which then impacts their bargaining power or decision-making about their own health and autonomy. So all these social norms also impact their access to health information and technology. Globally, only 46% of women are working compared to 76% of adult men. So this is a glaring figure. If women are not working, they will not have money to access health information, own mobile phones. So it is very important that we talk about what is stopping women from going to the workforce, what is stopping women from accessing healthcare, and social norms play a huge role. So I'm going to talk about the surveys that in the last 1 or 2 years I've conducted in India. So these surveys had so the main objective of the survey was not to study social media, but because social media is all pervasive now. So I have collected information on social media usage, both in urban settings, in surveys in urban setting and rural settings. So I'm going to talk about those two case studies. So I have a project on mental health and well-being of working men and women in urban India. Here, through this survey data that was collected, it is quantitative data. I look at, for our benefit, and for our learning, we look at the association between gender and social media use as a source of news, because there was some data collected on this. And the setting that I use is of call center employees in India across 4 different states. the time period, it was conducted, the surveys were conducted in August and September of 2022, and the data collected was of 1,500 men, around 1,500 men and 1,100 women. And the quantitative data included questions on mental health scales, demographics, personal and life stressors, work-life stressors, but mostly, also importantly, time spent watching the news and main source of news. So I find here that women spend less time watching news on various platforms. So if you see here, women spend around 25 minutes watching the news on an average, and compared to men who spent almost 35 minutes watching the news. Now, this could be that these are working women who are going, and these are young, and if you see the demographics, this is call center workers. So these are younger people. They are mostly in the age group of 18 and 25. They are literate, educated. So they have at least completed a high school degree. And as is the religious component of India, they are mostly from Hindu families. So if we see, it's also, this could be that the time spent watching the news is lesser for women because they might have to go back home and help their families in care work and household responsibilities. So when we look at, when asked about social media, whether they trusted, whether they used, it was not about trust, whether they used social media as a source of news, around 52% women said that they did trust, they used social media as a source of news, compared to 64% men. So this shows that, I mean, when men are using social media for a source of news, so they might be more prone to both information and misinformation in this urban setting. So I ran some basic regression. This is just something really basic that which includes some controlling for age, education, city, and religion. I find that women are 19% less likely to use social media platforms as a source of news in comparison to their male counterparts. So there was another survey that I conducted in the rural Indian setting, and this was to understand the drivers of COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy. And this was conducted in Chikbalapur district, which is near Bangalore, where I live in India. So here I look at, does socioeconomic status, does gender and socioeconomic status affect the usage of social media as a trusted source for health information? So here there's question on vaccination status, medical history related to COVID and COVID-19 vaccination, experience with vaccine-related adverse effects, and trust in sources of information around decision-making and perceived behavioral control and barriers to access to COVID vaccines. And the sample size was around 1,500 households, which were surveyed in October. So here, if you see, so there were three groups that we surveyed: those with 0 doses who had not taken any vaccine, then those with partial vaccination who had taken 1 shot, but the second shot had been long due. And then those with fully vaccinated. We tried to have equal sample size for each, around 500. So we find that those with 0 and partial vaccination were lesser educated and poorer compared to fully vaccinated. So then here I'm presenting here results on social media usage as a source of opinions, verification, and trusted sources for COVID-19 vaccine. And we don't find any differential on the basis of gender, but I do find that compared to the middle income group, people who have higher income did use social media as a source of opinions, for verification, and as a trusted source for COVID-19 vaccine information. And similarly, compared to the least educated, people who have at least class 6, who have done some kind of primary education or higher education, they are trusting social media as a source of opinions, verification, and trusted sources for COVID-19 vaccination. I don't find any effects on religion and caste. So, of course, this was all correlational evidence, just to caveat it. I should have prefaced. This is not causal evidence. So the findings, the correlational findings from the 2 case studies show that women use social media platform lesser than their male counterparts for news. Economic status of individuals, income, and education does define the usage of social media as a trusted source for important health information. These findings highlight a need for social listening policies that are more inclusive and diverse. So then I've talked about socio-cultural norms. I've talked about how women don't have access to mobile phones. So how do we bring change then? So what is the causal evidence that exists that, so a lot of researchers, I'm an economist and researcher myself, we build evidence so that we can change policy. And here we are trying to move the needle, form some kind of guideline, it's important to look at, and it is my responsibility to show you the kind of evidence that already exists. So when we look at, and when I talk about normative here, I mean social beliefs and individual behaviors. So there are these direct policies that have led to changes in behaviors and individual beliefs, which are, for example, norms which are teaching people, or norms that are creating awareness, or talking about domestic violence and how, recruiting people from villages and telling people to be ambassadors and spreading information about domestic violence. And so those kind of programs of just like creating awareness have worked, there's causal evidence that exists that they have worked in changing individual norms. Then there are these indirect policies which were really not targeted towards changing individual beliefs or norms, gender norms, but they have been successful in changing norms. For example, soap operas in Brazil, advent of cable TV in India. So there were TV shows which were showing less, smaller family sizes. They were showing women handling family businesses. In all these TV shows, women were not getting beat up by their husband. There was no domestic violence. So then there's evidence that shows that then women in households in India demanded from their family that, we will also have lesser number of children. So they demanded, then they talked about domestic violence and how it does not seem appropriate because this was also normalized earlier. So these kind of indirect policies, unintentionally indirect, I can have unintentional, unintended consequences as well. Then, of course, there are these economic policies giving economic incentives which can change individual behavior, such as there have been direct economic incentives to delay child marriage. So because we know that delaying age of marriage is self-correcting. If just age of marriage delays for girls, then they get more educated, they have more avenues to learn skills, they have more avenues to go and work. So, and they then have less number of children. It's just self-correcting. And there's a lot of evidence to show that just giving money to families to delay the marriages for girls has worked. There's causal evidence. Then there's also evidence on reservations for women, providing, so there has been in panchayats and in local politics, 33% of the seats are reserved for women in India. So just having that policy in place led to women being role models, acting as role models. So people educating their children, and it led to there was a survey on gender attitude and just changed people's gender behavior and trust in female leadership. Then, of course, there are these indirect policies, which are also economic in nature, involve some kind of incentive, but they have improved health and educational outcomes for women, such as providing bicycles to girls to go to school. Then, in a very traditional state in India, in Haryana, there was this availability of call center jobs, business processing, outsourcing jobs for women. So call centers prefer women because of their comparative advantage in interpersonal skills. So then just the advent of these jobs led to women getting more food to eat at home, on higher nutrition, women now getting more education, going for computer classes, earning income, delay in age at marriage. So just availability of jobs for women could bring a lot of change in terms of behavior and health outcomes for women. So, so this is my last slide. So how can we then integrate? So I talked about some of the economic incentives, and so what has really worked in reducing specifically the gender digital divide? So in India, in one of the states, they have distributed mobile phones to approximately 2 million women belonging to economically disadvantaged groups to tackle the gender-based digital divide. There's an ongoing study by professors at Yale and Harvard to assess the impact of this on not just women using mobile phones, but also on information. So now, on information and misinformation. Now, if people have mobile phones, does it lead to more misinformation? So they're testing that as well. And the findings of this study might be very useful for this gathering. So I mean, this is an ongoing study. So there are also certain other things that people have done to reduce the digital divide, which is set up mobile phone vaccine registration and reminder system for child vaccination coverage in rural, hard-to-reach areas and urban street dwellers in populations of Bangladesh. So they have connected people with mobile phones with healthcare workers directly so that they can be sent reminders. This has been done in developed country settings as well, but this has worked in developing country settings. There is evidence, causal evidence to support that. That's why I wanted to highlight that. Then, of course, we have been talking about online channels and offline channels. So what are these offline channels that can be deployed to bring women and other minorities into this ecosystem of social listening? So there have been these mobile vaccination drives where there are these cars or buses, or they go around and give information to people in villages and far-flung areas where there's less access to mobile phones, to give information, and these have worked as well. They've also used these kind of social mobilizers to bust myths and misinformation on COVID-19 vaccines. So actually going in those villages. We have a very wide network of community health workers, which are door-to-door health workers. These health workers have also been used in India to provide door-to-door vaccination service during COVID. And that's why the vaccination program has been successful, because we have tried to get to the last mile, do the last mile delivery. Of course, there have been challenges, but we have these wide networks of community health workers. And many countries have these kind of, these are Asha women. These are women who are going door to door, and they then know the families. So then people listen to them. So providing accurate women and training to these community health workers might also be useful in learning, in providing correct information, and also learning on what are the challenges that people are facing in these areas. And something which has worked for child immunization has also been using social networks such as trusted community members. So there are these trusted community members, local leaders, or religious leaders. Then also, but more than that, something which has worked is the gossip network or information advisors, ambassadors. So these are people who are, so what they did in this causal study, and this is a study by Nobel laureates in economics. So what they did was, they figured out, they did a very short survey, small survey in villages, like 15, 17 people, and figured out who was the person giving them. Where are they getting the information from? Who is the person giving them information? Then they found these gossip ambassadors, gave them phone, and then they would give them information because they knew that they were well connected, and they would disseminate correct information about vaccines. So these kind of gossip networks, we often undermine these, often don't understand how communities and ties work in these kind of areas, and using them might be very, very useful, especially in a diverse country like India. Using community health networks, but also religious and local leaders might also be useful, because people tend to follow what the community leaders are doing. So, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Batija. So perhaps we can take questions after we hear from Mr. Sufemi as well. Yeah. So thank you again. So we'll invite you up to the front again after we hear the very final presentation. Yeah. So so I think it's hugely important that we raise a very important component, which is gender related and its impact, its potential impact on social listening, and of course, the sort of issues that could arise, including epistemic injustice. Thinking about it from the initial presentation. For our very final presentation, we are going to shift to Indonesia. Mr. Harry Sufemi, he is the founder of the Mofindo platform and organization, and they are essentially an anti-hoax organization. So I think it links up very well with what we've heard about fake news and how we ought to be addressing this particular issue. So we're going to look at some of the brilliant work that's being done by Mr. Sufemi's organization, as well as some of the challenges and insights that could feed into a number of developments, including, of course, as I've mentioned before, the ethics guidance document that's being formulated. So just going to get the slides up and we shall be on our way.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. During the when the COVID pandemic started, we predicted that we will be facing two pandemic, which another one is infodemic, and we were right. And we quickly do the social media listening. And a bit about Mofindo, we started as actually Facebook group. I started debunking hoaxes in that group, and suddenly thousands of people joined in, so that exploded. And then after a year, Mofindo had to be founded because there were so many activities and members, so we need something to manage them all. And 2020, we worked with UNICEF and CDC in various pandemic effort, and later a bit we began also social media listening activities. And now Mofindo consisted of near 100,000 online volunteers, 40 chapters in various areas in Indonesia, and 1,000 plus local volunteers. During the during the activity, this is the scope. We try to listen to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and surprisingly to us, YouTube. The methods that we're using, we were given access to Talkwalker by UNICEF. This is the social listening tool created by Nielsen. And pretty soon we realized that we need to do also manual listening in various WhatsApp public groups. The definition of WhatsApp public groups is the groups, WhatsApp groups that we can find the invitation or joining links through the internet or Google. And also we try to actively monitoring known hoax actors network. And then later on, we also try to rely to reports from community and the public. This is a sample timeline graphs. We check various peaks on the graphic and then find out what's the cause. And most of the time that will reveal various insightful information. Word cloud seemed to be at first to be an eye candy feature, but turned out it can be quite useful to tweak the keywords being used to be listened. Sometimes keyword that we weren't set up before shows up in this, and then we put it out in the configuration, and it resulted in a lot of conversations. So turned out this is quite useful. And then we also do manual tagging of the raw data from the Talkwalker. This is done by the Mofindo's research group. And as you can probably imagine, with the size of social media users in Indonesia, and we are doing weekly reports. This is actually quite heroic efforts on their part to manually tag those data. So this is quite amazing, actually. And when we found out that we can listen to the YouTube comments, we started doing that, and turned out it is a goldmine for insights. We Before that, we downplayed YouTube because we thought we cannot automatically monitor videos, images, things like that. But turn out when we can listen to the comments, it doesn't really matter anymore. There are a lot of insightful data and conversation we got by listening to the YouTube comments. So I can recommend this to everyone. And drilling down, when you find interesting tidbit of information, sometimes our team will drill down further onto that, and most of the time we will find various surprises from that activity. For example, when the government of Indonesia started requiring people to be vaccinated before entering the mall, it was at first for basically to secure the mall environment, so only the vaccinated people can enter the mall. But turn out it became an incentive to be vaccinated instead. So we found out, and we reported this to the National COVID-19 Task Force, and they continue to act up on that. So yeah, it's very interesting. Monitoring the influencers, reach does not always equal to engagement. For example, the top one, Jokowi, the president, have 30 million reach, but the engagement is almost the same by the next user, Kopi Ganja, only 100,000 reach, but very highly engaged. So, and then we usually check on the highly engaged content and see what kind of content is that, how it is delivered, things like that. And then we advise the Minister of Health and other parties on how to better present information to the people. Hoax actors, yeah, we need to keep tabs on these troublemakers. And talk worker, this is the almost raw data is something like this. But to normal people, this might be quite confusing at first, lots of data and graphics. So we started to do a combined analysis in our report. So the combined analysis is basically the results of understanding the SML from talk worker and combining that with understanding the manual listening and also public reports, and then analyze them as a whole. Then usually we get a different picture and different perspective by doing this, and this is quite turning out to be quite insightful. So getting the automated results from social listening tools is nice and good and very useful, but when you combine that with manual analysis to further gain insight into those, and then usually we can unearth various very useful information. This is how we manage the public reports. It's queued, managed, and tracked, and we got quite a lot of insights from this facility. And yes, there are a lot of noise in this by providing this facility to the public, but this tool help us to manage those, to try to keep the signal versus noise ratio to as high as possible. And I won't lie, this is a lot of work and it needs somebody that dedicated for this. So we did that, but the result is worth it. And at first we were just doing the social listening reports, but we began delivering the reports to the various parties, academics, RCC group, Ministry of Health, National COVID-19 Task Force, and so on. And then not too long after that, we started getting feedbacks from those parties. So we tried to manage that. And it wasn't too long before it began to become into interesting discussions and then collaborations. So we created a forum to enable just that. And very soon, nearly everyone was in that group. So everyone suddenly is easily reachable, easily contactable, and we can collaborate very quickly. It's as simple as a WhatsApp group. But whenever crisis emerges, high priority hoaxes emerges, we can quickly contact anyone and get something done. So it's very, very interesting. Some problem we encounter during the activity, access to the public space. Twitter now, post Elon Musk, you already know, limit access to its public space very severely unless you pay a lot. This is not really a problem for us at the moment because Talk Worker take care of that, so we still have access to Twitter, but not everyone can afford that, so we need to consider that as well. This is part of the problem. With Facebook, there is no way to monitor the public timeline. So even if people mark their posts as public, we still cannot monitor those. We can only monitor public groups, and even then it must be chosen manually. With the size of social media audience in Indonesia, this is just not feasible, unfortunately. With Instagram, we can only monitor hashtags. While actually Instagram in Indonesia, the comment section is very, very lively, but we are not able to access that. So we are missing out a lot. And TikTok, there's simply no official way to listen to its public spaces. And this is getting worrying because TikTok users is very high in Indonesia. They are very active and there are a lot of misinformation and disinformation here. If we can at least monitor the comments, it would be a bit better, but there is just no way to do that. And with what happens in Philippines election, a lot of parties in Indonesia are really concerned about this naturally. YouTube is rather an anomaly, and we are thankful for that. We are able to listen to the video's comments. And Mavindo, in case of Instagram, we tried to create a listening bot for Instagram, and it was met with very, very aggressive anti-bot system. So that sucks. Conclusions: access to public spaces in various social media platforms are actively blocked, unfortunately. So we actually have very little visibility into the public spaces. This is a concern because this in turn may result in ineffective media social listening and or health threats. You already familiar with the 3 blind men and an elephant story. Definitely you don't want that here. In turn, this may also cause harm or danger to the general public, and due to inability to recognize potential issues and problems in a timely manner. Public reporting mechanism enable the discovery of a lot of interesting issues. Manual listening and or drilling down helps to make for a wholesome result and enable better insights. Social media accessibility is very heavily tilted to the western parts of Indonesia, unfortunately. Very little of the eastern parts of Indonesia access it, or part of the digital divide issue. Some of the recommendations, we have a community in Indonesia called Kawal COVID. This is a community that's concerned about the COVID pandemic, and they were able to predict and prepare for the pandemic faster than Indonesian government. It's because of its social media listening activity. So this is a very interesting. So I think SML should be an integral part of disaster preparation and recovery effort. Social media platforms must open access to its public spaces to certain parties. To my knowledge, to this date, only one state has created such regulation, which is the New York State. I'm not aware of other state or country which has similar regulation, but I think that is a very good idea. Provide a public reporting facility with proper funding and support to ensure its effectiveness. Collaboration with various stakeholders will enable better analysis and understanding of the SML's big data. It can be as simple as a distribution and feedback mechanism. Develop policy and regulations for an effective SML. Advocating to the social media platforms does not work. We've been doing that for years and they just won't change at all. On the other hand, following regulations is almost like a no-brainer for these platforms. So I think it would be a much better investment to do more work on creating an effective regulations for the social media platforms than advocating to these platforms, because I can understand they have a lot of interest, their business revenue and so on. So it just doesn't work. I think it's better to create an effective regulations instead. And it is worth it to make an effort to try to amplify the impact. Invest time to build good relations with various stakeholders. I'm not gonna lie, this is a lot of work, a lot of time. It's a hard work. During the pandemic, I'm doing a lot of meetings with a lot of people, and even then, it doesn't provide a lot of results. But thankfully, I met new friends, and these new friends works even better than me. So then we can start. Then we were able to start distributing the reports. We start getting the feedback, and then we start collaborating effectively. That's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Supemi. I think on that, it's a brilliant way to end off the conference. Now, please, if you join me to thank Dr. Batija and Mr. Supemi for their excellent presentations and the very engaged discussion. Thank you again, Dipshika and Harry. So it's been relatively long 2.5 days. I'd like to express my gratitude to everyone for your great participation, great inputs, insights. There's a lot to think about, lots to work on, and also, of course, to our participants via Zoom. So there will be follow-up activities in terms of conference proceedings, as I've mentioned. Some of the outputs, particularly those that, or some of the thoughts that Sistan most recently shared with us, right? These are more blue sky ideas that we could take on in terms of academic outputs. So there will be an academic platform. So a lot of these ideas, I think they are worth following up on. And then there's the more applied output, most immediately the ethics guidance document. So that's going to have a very practical focus. It's more time bound. So that's something I think some of us will continue discussion on. But at a very general level, there will be conference proceedings. So for all speakers, we will be circulating conference proceedings. You can tell us if we represented you correctly or otherwise. And that will, of course, become a public document. So recordings also available, as I've mentioned, unless presenters decide to withhold consent, in which case we will still have the proceedings. So we hope that all presenters will agree to at least have a very short summary of what you did intend to say and to be shared in the public domain. So that really is all I have to say. I'd like to thank my colleagues, especially Candy and Jane, for the immense effort in supporting this conference over a couple of days, and also with travel arrangements and all the other logistics. So thank you so much. Thank you. So with this, we will be in touch on a number of follow-up activities, and of course, we look forward to continuing discussion. This will hopefully be the start of continuing engagements to follow. Thanks again, everyone. Okay, so bye for now.